Well, Nicola Sturgeon and her book is absolutely everywhere. The press are full of the tiniest revelations. The Queen used to gossip, apparently, Begorra, and apparently right-wingers are fuming over that fact, really. We have a look, neither of us have read the book, but take a look at really what's sitting behind some of the more serious revelations, particularly over the wisdom of pressing on with the gender recognition reforms, and behind the scenes, what was really happening. Are we going to learn anything that helps us with creating a more democratic country in Scotland that isn't so reliant on leaders and top-down instruction through all of this, or just promote Nicola Sturgeon's book sales? So we talk about all of that, and also the big wind farm convention that was held in Inverness yesterday, where I was present making a film. Are these guys just NIMBYs who need to knuckle down and accept the hardware the same as everyone else for the green transition? Or has planning for it and democracy about it just gone completely out the window? We talk about all of that. So those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's unexpected Leslie Riddick podcast. Leslie, you have returned from the Highlands. Happy up there? Everybody cheery? Enjoying the sunshine? Looking forward to some more windmills?
Not in the least. And actually I should say to people, I don't know how we just got it wrong. I mean, this is part of, in a way, you know, the sort of speedy handover, which I'm very grateful you were able to jump in when Pat decided to stand down. And suddenly in the middle of the summer, we've got holidays, things, you know, booked. So anyway, it's next week. I'm going on holiday.
Had this carefully planned and even, I think, put in a calendar, but rush of blood to the head last week when we were sprackling away and said a totally wrong thing. And here we are today.
Indeed. So I wasn't away yesterday we're making this film about the kind of Highland. I think a lot of people from I've spoken to think the Highlanders are being basically NIMBYs and kind of complaining about a lot of hardware that everybody else, you know, to the south, and it's not everybody else, but a heck of a lot of other people have just had to put up with. But it was fascinating, actually, for 4 or 5 days of filming, going round different glens. There was not a place we went to that didn't already have 5 or 7 wind farms. That's the bit I hadn't got. So there's places that are being asked to take another 13 wind farms that have got 7 already in a glen 20 miles long. So, you know, it's like, in a funny kind of way, I think the thing for these guys is once bitten, twice, well, not just shy, but just, you know, adamant that's enough. And actually, we didn't meet a single person in our filming who was kind of a climate change denier or anti-net zero. Quite a lot of people who just said, do you know, what we want to do is have a discussion with all the authorities about the totality of what they're planning for this glen, because there's probably 2 or 3 wind farms we wouldn't really object to particularly, and then there's 1 or 2 we totally don't want for particular reasons. One place we went to, Fèis, which is a monument on a hill above Eventon, is used by, you know, everybody locally, but also has ashes there, has weddings at the top, all sorts of things. A real kind of local monument. And that one, I think a lot of people will just strap themselves to the mountain basically before anything goes behind it. And then around that, there is what appears to be the lack of a strategic plan. And this is because the way this all works is the British government sets targets for energy. What kind of energy it wants. It then creates contracts for difference to, if you like, subsidise or make contracts with wind farm producers who must then get grid connection and find a location. So there's a hell for leather dash to be the first one in, because that way you're more likely to get planning because there ain't a whole lot of others around. There's a massive problem with grid connection, even for the existing wind farms, because there just isn't enough, which is why that huge subsea connector is being built, but it's only being started now. So a lot of this stuff will go in and we will end up paying constraint payments for those wind farms not to operate. So stick all of that together, really, and then put on top of it 2 other factors. I mean, to me, the thing that's fascinating about this is how it's shining a light on stuff that is just bad, has been bad structures and disempowering for, you know, in some cases almost forever. One is land ownership. So, you know, behind the scenes, a lot of landowners are doing deals and making quite a bit of money out of this. And to be fair, some crofters are as well. But the basic thing of it is, if you've got a tiny number of landowners, you can make some pretty big deals rather quickly. And some of those landowners who are new have bought land up knowing that this is the purpose for it. They don't live here. That's fine. Well, that's fine if you like. It annoys an awful lot of people to have absentees, but that's one thing. They are actually front companies that just have an address, basically, somewhere in Dorking, and might not even have traded for a long time. It's a wee bit reminds you of the PPE contracts, companies that were just set up to get that and had no expertise in it. There's a bit of that going on. So landowners. And the other thing is, sorry to keep battering on, but it will keep being the case. Highland Council is the largest council on the planet. And in any other country, all these community councils, and again, to remind people, the community councils that came together yesterday for the big convention, 56 in the end of them came together, representing between a third and a half of the Highland population. Those community councils in any other country would be councils. They wouldn't be community councils that have a budget of £400 a year, which is meant to be spent on stationery and have no statutory powers at all. Although they are consultees in planning, so they should be listened to, but they can easily just be papped aside. So in a way, yesterday was the Highlanders doing what I suspect many people in the borders, in Ayrshire, in the Lothians, might have been thinking in retrospect they might have liked to have done, which is get everybody together and just say, you're not doing this. I mean, sorry, I'm thinking about this with all that's being said about Ukraine. If it's not, if we're not in it, it's not for us. And actually, this is the same. Big decisions being made about the rural parts of Scotland essentially becoming industrialised pretty much with no benefit locally in terms of money. And that brings us to yesterday's event, because I've got to say there was no turn up from the Scottish government and no turn up from British government and no turn up from SSEN, who are the big pylons guys. They decide infrastructure, location and so on. But there were SNP MSPs and an MP, and there was one solitary Labour MP, Torquil Crichton from the Western Isles, on the panel, along with various Conservatives and Lib Dems. And I've got to say the SNP really were taking pelters. Here, for example, just as a wee snifter of it, is Emma Roddick.
Occasions. So I'm more than happy, as I've said, I've worked with other parties on this panel. I've worked with locals before on specific policy issues. I'm happy to do that. I know that the reason that we're all on this panel is we're all happy to do that. So please do come and speak to me. But don't imagine I've got powers that I don't.
Yeah, okay, absolutely, we get that, we really do, Emma. I mean, maybe one of the things you could do is pick up the phone to Kate Ford, our highest ranking MSP in the Highlands. She should have been here today. And also, start lobbying Gillian Martin, the Scottish Energy Minister. We all need to try and do our bit to get into the room.
Yeah, I spoke to Gillian yesterday. I'm more than happy to do that.
Now, you can hear a disquiet in the audience there, but here is the very next contribution to that, which was from Edward Mountain. As he points out here, he is saying he has no particular skin in the game because he's not standing again.
Now, I'm going to be quite clear about my view. I'm not standing for election. You're going to see in 2026. So my view is simply this. We are, in the Highlands, being used for industrialisation. We are being sacrificed on the altar of net zero. There are just too many projects floating around with no plan. I think it's absolutely important that we get a plan. And we also need to stop these electricity companies trying to bribe local communities with I'm going to support everything on that list. And I want to debate this in the Parliament. I want to have an honest debate. A cynic would say that this government has complete control of planning and are doing nothing about it. And they're making you and me, the Highlanders, pay for the rest of the country's electricity.
Wow,
So
it's
that,
quite the contrast,
isn't it?
there. And of course, it's we've got ourselves into a situation, it seems, where the whole public discourse and rhetoric in Scotland for the last, I don't know, what's that, a decade and a half maybe, was that we were pro-wind, we were not, your Little Englanders, we were not David Cameron's Conservative Party refusing to have onshore wind. We were the kind of escape valve for the industry. You could come up here and have projects put in the ground, and we were pushing further ahead with net zero in a way that other people weren't. But all that goodwill seems to have been completely destroyed, and that's a big meeting, and pretty serious responses there.
Yes, and the terrible irony of this is, at this rate, the SNP will lose all their MSPs in the Highlands. Having sat through that meeting now, I'll quite grant you a lot of things. One is, all the community councils are required by law to have ways of consulting people before they do anything. And everyone we interviewed was very careful not to overreach in any way at all when they were speaking to us. And some places only had a 30% response rate, which could suggest people are on holiday, or, people are, well, I'm not all that bothered really. I'll give you that. But looking at it the other way, my family come from Caithness, as people may well know. I have been in and about the Highlands pretty much all my life. I have never seen this level of activism. This is the trouble is that in many respects, the SNP and Labour, Torkel was no better, are sort of having to parrot out lines that sound good to somebody very, very far away, but working in a top-down country, which is both Britain and Scotland, you're finally having these ideas about where you can stack stuff, and the basic free-for-all that is the energy market. And let's just say, it's a market, right? Every other country has got energy under control because it didn't privatize it in the 1980s. So we've got a Wild West market in energy. I slightly exaggerate for effect, but not that much. And nobody is tackling that. So the guys at the very end of the food chain who are just watching people amble in and decide, at their leisure pretty much where stuff will go, and watch a Scottish government approve, I think I'm right in saying, every single application to date, even overturning ones that have been rejected by Highland Council, that is producing a complete loss of faith in what the Scottish Government's planning powers are about. Now, I did ask the Scottish Government, why they weren't turning up. And, there's the usual one about conflict of interest, yada, yada. Some people have pointed out there doesn't seem to be a conflict of interest when people are being lobbied by a lot of the interests in this debate. And that's, that's well and good. But, if we don't have the Electricity Act recited as something that says powers are reserved to Westminster, again, yep, I'm sure that's fine. If that's fine, then how are we able to say that we will use planning in this country not to have new nuclear plants? It looks like we're ready to flex a muscle in one direction, and you then begin to wonder, are we? Are we going to do that? There was a huge cheer in the meeting for Jamie Stone, the Lib Dem, who said he's now fighting to get one of these new nuclear plants, reactors, put into Dounreay. This made me just about tear my hair out listening to this. But because people think, okay, if it isn't going to be more wind, we need more other types of energy, they're now beginning to listen to arguments like this in the same area that witnessed the Dounreay shaft, which will be radioactive till the end of time, being lied about for decades. So there's such a bad lot of politics going on here. And just to finish it, the point is, I think I'm right in saying again, the Highlands voted yes. Across the whole piece, different places, this and that, but over the piece. And a lot of campaigners and yesers who are listening to this and are in the Highlands will know how hard they worked for that. And what they're finding now is the baby is going out with the bathwater. And that's the main reason that I thought this is worth having a film about, because wakey SNP, this is not to say the green transition isn't important. It's to say this is the moment where you stop doing things over people's heads and you have to negotiate. It's like the HPMAs, the highly protected marine areas. One happened in Arran because the ecologists sat down with the fishermen and figured it out. Then Edinburgh put through an edict that they were going to decide. Everybody opposed it and conservation got kicked out the window. You can't do this top down anymore. And yet, doubtless, the machinery will just continue. So anyway, the film will be coming out as soon as we've edited it.
I mean, it's the Dounreay shaft, just mind blowing for anybody who can't remember that. It was basically just a great big hole in the ground where they tipped stuff, highly contaminated nuclear waste, and didn't keep any records of what was in there at all until I think it's a big concrete lid on the top of it, as I recall, which blew off at one point. It was a major explosion. And they slowed down the use of it. But I mean, this is hugely contaminated. There was all sorts of nuclear particles on the beach and goodness knows what else. And you're getting a round of applause. Yeah, bring us back one of them.
This is just how far the politics have just let this debate slide. And I would guess, teetering towards the Nicola Sturgeon everywhere thing. This is another one where if you get this wrong, you see a whole legion of people then beginning to turn against the whole ideas that, the SNP stood for. And so, I mean, I hardly know where to start with all this, because I was running around and hardly hearing any of the exchanges. But when you look at the headlines, everyone has been, there's some of the trivial stuff that's been coming out of this is just unbelievable. I mean, there's one right-wingers fume over Nicola Sturgeon's Queen comments. I mean, all she said was she liked a bit of gossip. Really? That's a story? Then there's another one. Top Scottish author says Nicola book launch could harm his sales. Darren McGarvey. The book's coming out the same day as his book.
Hats off to Darren for getting a bit of a splash on it. But I mean, for goodness sake, I mean, have to say, very much looking forward to this being over and Nicola Sturgeon just kind of sliding off to be the sort of Edward Heath of the SNP and just kind of not remembered or not brought back to mind would be closer to the mark. I mean, they're obviously just someone who divides opinion, and you have to remember, of course, through the last decade, literally millions of pounds have been spent advertising Nicola Sturgeon and giving people a particular view of her. So that has stuck in many places, and there are lots of people, and I saw lots of Vox Pops on STV, I think in Ayrshire or possibly in Govan, in her constituency, basically welcoming what she was saying and, seeing the sort of emotional side and the 3D view of life, and saying that they felt that she had that she was doing a good job in the way that she had written her book and that she was being candid. I mean, it's an odd thing. I mean, I'm not a Nicola Sturgeon fan. I don't think I've ever really been a Nicola Sturgeon fan. I must be one of the very few people who've been in these sorts of circles in the SNP for the length of time that I have that has no photograph of me and Nicola. I was very much not into the selfies. I was a friend of Alex Salmond, and of course I worked for Joanna Cherry during all the Brexit and the prorogation right up to the most recent general election, and I was her election agent, so I knew kind of what was going on in terms of how campaigns were being run, for example, in 2017, which I think we talked about a few weeks ago. So, I mean, some of these headlines are very strange. The Times has been serialising it, obviously kind of taking out some of the juicy bits, but she's put stuff in that's clearly untrue or has a kind of scintilla of truth, where she's able to take some memory or conversation and build it out into something much different, which has been quite quickly knocked down by various people. So, I mean, the idea that Alex Salmond was against equal marriage has been completely, flatly rejected by Alec Neil, who took forward the bill. He says, contrary to what she claims Alex Salmond was not opposed to gay marriage legislation. I was the health secretary who took the bill through Parliament at Alex's request, and he told me that Nicola didn't want to do it any longer and she was fed up with it. And then Craig Murray reflects on the fact that Gordon Wilson, if you remember, former SNP leader, was very outspoken and opposed to the Equal Marriage Bill. So my friend Gordon Wilson was unfortunately opposed to gay marriage, and he argued vigorously with Alex about it. Alex was absolutely supporting gay marriage, and Sturgeon is spreading utter lies to try and take credit for herself. You then had the bizarre, what would you even call it? It was a kind of admission or contrition that she should have paused the Gender Recognition Act and listened more. And then, of course, you get the usual stick about this being a highly toxic debate and, terrible on both sides, which in many ways it wasn't. I mean, the gender-critical feminists, if you think about activist groups like Murray, Blackburn and Mackenzie, were very educated women, former civil servants, researchers, putting together really structured and high-quality bits of evidence which were being ignored. She misspeaks really weirdly in the ITV interview about Isla Bryson, and this is a question that he surely must have anticipated coming up and still doesn't manage to have a really cogent answer for it.
Now, this was when Julie Etchingham from... we'll put the link in to the best little clip of this if anyone doesn't want to wade through the whole thing, but when the interviewer asked is Isla Bryson a man, and then she said, I would say anyone who commits the most heinous male crime against women probably forfeits the right to be the gender of their choice. And then I think there's a moment where that sinks in with both, and Julie Etchingham goes, what?
Well, Julie Etchingham, I think, is really ready to pounce on her and gives her a doof. And then Nicola realises that actually, in terms of gender ideology, that's something that really is not supposed to be said. And I was brought back to mind Jim Spence on debate night with Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Do you mean Jim Spence? The sports commentator.
Yeah, I do indeed remember the sports commentator.
I missed
He was on
right? Okay,
debate night with Alex Cole-Hamilton, and Alex gets asked the same question, and Jim Spence was, well, you can see his dodger through his leggings. Looks like a man to me. But Alex Cole-Hamilton comes back and says, I'm not qualified to make that assessment, and that's the kind of rhetoric that has to be readily embraced if you're going for a very purist form of gender ideology, that you can't concede to the notion that that you can identify sexes very readily, which any human can. You can. Any human is very. It's a kind of core biology thing to be able to identify the difference between sexes, regardless of how they present. So she gets herself into sort of deep water there. And then says that somebody who's, as you say, committed such a heinous male crime forfeits that right. But there was a Michelle Thompson proposal to prevent exactly that, so that you couldn't have situations, particularly during the process of the prosecution of those crimes, where a person could self-ID into the opposite gender and then require their victim to address them as female when giving evidence. But these were, kind of viciously rejected. The book also kind of tries to give us
just before you go on to that, I mean, it seems to me this bit here, there's a very good article by Shona Craven in The National who's pointing out, and it is there to be understood, that if you concede any ground on this, the whole proposition of self-ID unravels, because you either have rights or you don't. And I don't know, I think I've heard people, commentators say that was some of the problem with Michelle's amendment, because if you did kind of say you've got the right to do whatever you want except in this circumstance and that circumstance, and that's some of the difficulty with this whole thing. It's a very all or nothing, and it leads you at the beginning, you can agree with some of the points which are generally speaking, let live and let live. It takes you into a moment where you're looking at somebody who's got a very bulging set of tights on in front of you, and you can't say that looks like a biological man.
Yes.
And then when you can't say what is kind of like there, you start to hit massive difficulties, and you've got a situation where you ended up with a convicted rapist who can end up being in a women's prison. And all the way along the line, okay, there can be should be alarm bells sounding with all of this, because that's the logical conclusion that you arrive at. I would hate to have been at the start of this trying to figure out if there was any proper way, legal way, to get this all to sit together. But for sure, the ignoring of people coming in, and this is my big thing about this whole Nicola stuff, and actually to me, where we are with a lot of the what we've talked about at the beginning here, which is just the application of kind of decisions about planning to small communities who can't say anything, is there's just not enough people in the room. Nicola and Peter Murrell and maybe one or two others, maybe John Swinney, got in on the decision-making front. And
I don't think John Swinney even got in on the
okay, so we'll leave John Swinney in the corridor.
Pretty, it's a trifectorate. It was just... it was extremely.
So it was Liz
small.
Lloyd was the other.
It wasn't so much a circle as a triangle, I think.
So those three were basically deciding absolutely everything, from the construction of conferences to the costing of conferences to, who from the SNP could get in to speak, to the schedule, to the agenda, to the policy. And, once you've got into this need to control everything, and I suspect even as somebody who was asked to be stand for the SNP back in the day, even apparently a change in conference to allow independents to stand under the SNP banner, which is, I don't think that's very independent. Anyway, I was never interested. But I think there was a thing within it of taking the loudest voices into the camp, and essentially that then lets you silence them for all the better to control the movement. Now, some of that might be, let's just try to be a bit benign about this for a minute, it might be that feels to some people temperamentally as the best way to proceed. And there's a lot about what Nicola Sturgeon controlled in terms of, debate and her arguments, which were impressive as communication. But it's not democratic. In the end, what ends up happening is you've got just top down is the leitmotif of Scotland every bit as much as it's ever been of Britain. You're reproducing this problem over and over again, and here we are today, just all the problems there are in this country, spending time trying to pore over one sentence of one woman who has gone from public life.
Well, yes, I hope, has she gone from public life? We don't know.
Well, she's going to London for a while by the looks of it.
Yes, and but I think we've still got an SNP, and certainly a kind of senior leadership within the SNP and potentially within the cabinet who still look to her for guidance and a nod. There was also this, claim to have emotional intelligence, which is the ability to understand and use your own emotions in positive ways and to empathise with others to overcome challenges and diffuse conflict. I really don't see Nicola Sturgeon as somebody with a great deal of emotional intelligence. Alec, by contrast, had huge amounts of emotional intelligence. Alec would be the first person on the phone to somebody who was experiencing a problem to talk it through to them and speak to them. There was a very good interview with Michelle Thompson the other day on BBC Radio Scotland, where she used the phrase management by walking about, when she was at Standard Life. That was the kind of thing that you did. You kind of wandered around and spoke to people, and that's how you actually got ideas and how you kind of understood what was happening on the ground. There wasn't any of that with Nicola, in the same way that at the end of Thatcher's career, she was completely isolated and didn't listen to anybody and just pushed ahead. Nicola Sturgeon's never really been someone that sought people out or
but see, this is a weird one, because I'm sure there will be a lot of people listening to this, particularly women, who'll say, but I met her. The thing is, I watch her a lot. I've only met Nicola twice for about 30 seconds each time. So it's more, there's meeting and there's proper conversation. But what would happen is she would go to a right lot of events and be asked to speak or whatever. She would then move through the groups and do lots of selfies. So it's it's a different cultural thing. Meeting these days is having a memento. So there'll be a lot. You started off talking about not being in any picture, with Nicola. But lots of people will be sitting with pictures because she moved around them to that extent. It was, and I watched this happening on one occasion and just was sort of almost speechless with admiration for the skill of managing to spend about 1 minute with a group of people, give them something that they wanted, which was everyone just wants a selfie now, and then move on to the next group, do the same again, and manage to work around the room in about, I don't know, 10 minutes, basically, leaving everyone feeling that they'd met her. And, technically, absolutely, they did. But it's more than this. And this is the trouble. You're quite right, that her legacy endures, if you like, because the legacy of British political life is that you are top down controlling parties where there is, there is not. Labour's the same now. There's no democracy really within many parties. So, and then sniffing around the undergrowth of all the discontent with that, which is now, it's coming to the end of this being even vaguely viable, are shysters like Nigel Farage and co, who just feed on whatever system is beginning to fall to pieces. And because there's just not an ability for all these abstract ideas to withstand the reality of many places, because we haven't got a system that just lets place and people decide stuff for themselves, which they're perfectly capable of doing, we're getting an awful lot coming unstuck. But anyway, so this is me escalating it back out to the universe when you're trying to talk about specifics.
I suppose it's the difference between, I remember there was lots of talk about the difference between Clinton and Tony Blair. So when Tony Blair was at a lineup shaking hands with people, he was looking at the next person that he was going to shake the hands with. Where Clinton just had these sort of steely blue eyes that lasered in on you and touched your elbow and held on to you and grabbed you and then moved to the next person. And that had this kind of electric, charismatic connection. Nicola was very good at that kind of work, and you'll know, when you come off a stage, if you've been hosting something or if you've been speaking or you've been being asked questions and your brain's completely mush after having had to sort of triangulate all these different things, and then people come up and what about this, what about that, what about sod off and leave me alone, I've just been on stage for an hour and a half. So she was extremely studied at that, but that was part of her work. It was part of her professional business. And the backroom, backstage, chatting and taking sounding boards from people and seeking them out or remembering things and giving people a call, just to put the feelers out and to make contact with people, did not exist. And that's where I think people who don't know the inside of things and can't really understand why there was no communication, for example, with the Westminster Group, or why was she not even speaking to anybody in Holyrood, and it was so hermetically sealed against her own MSPs. I mean, Michelle Thompson is being asked by the presenter on BBC Scotland, but your reflections of her, and how was she like, what conversations you've had? She said, I don't know, I've never spoken to her.
I know it's jaw-dropping, isn't it? And I've got to say, I've heard that from so many people in both Westminster, and I can remember Alex Neil saying this when he was sacked as Communities Minister, and he said I think it was the first proper conversation he'd had with Nicola was getting sacked. So, I mean, but this to me is the bigger issue, is just this small cabal running anything. It's just bad news. I mean, what did we do? But what did we do with 2008? Everyone's analysis was having a bunch of, I'm sort of say, powered, alpha males who are sitting in a small, group of people deciding to take risky ventures and speculate with other people's money. Everyone went, yeah, that's the problem. You've got groupthink, you've got a tiny group of people who select one another. They select out diversity, real diversity. They select out the troublemakers. They select out democracy, though you don't need to have that particularly in a company. And then you end up just basically making really bad decisions.
Yeah. I mean, there's a good article by Robin McAlpine analysing some of the media stuff around this, which I think we'll link to, which will give people a better understanding of the, as I was saying, the kind of professional versus personal aspects of Nicola's character. I mean, you've said about Alec Neil. There was also a great piece by Dorothy Grace Elder talking about Margot MacDonald, and some journalist in a lift with Margot, and Nicola comes in and says a few words of pleasantries and then goes away, and the journalist asks Margot about something about her, and she says, I don't know, that's the first time she's ever spoken to me in my life. So this is a kind of long-haired thing, and it might be shyness, but it makes for really poor management, and it gets us to the position where we are at the moment. And she did come unstuck on the idea that any man could self-identify as a woman regardless of background or any other issues, and that kind of purest form of self-ID that you spoke about, and not being able to countenance the fact that there could have been any problems. Now, you also mentioned about the difficulty of legislating around these matters if you accept that as your core premise. I mean, way back in the midst of time, as we were going through these things, after I think the first consultation, Joanna Cherry wrote to Shirley Ann Somerville, along with a trans woman, saying that there were clearly problems being thrown up, and there were circumstances and issues where rights could conflict, and it would be far better to tease these out and analyse them and decide whether they're problems or not, and put in measures to address them, rather than simply having this no debate mantra and refusing to accept any kind of issue at all. And Neil Hanvey has the same quote out over the last couple of days, saying that he had a meeting with Shirley Ann Somerville in 2019.
Shirley Ann, in this context, being relevant
Shirley Ann
because
Somerville was the minister responsible for the bill at that point. He was trying to raise safeguarding concerns about young detransitioners and other issues around the bill, and was told basically that they have to stay silent on these matters, that this was not something that they were going to enter into. So Nicola Sturgeon had adequate opportunity to see the problems as they rose and rose and rose, and refused to engage with them at all. But the interview, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the whole 28 minutes unless you're particularly interested. The Rob McAlpine article is very useful as the contrast. And I was thinking particularly at the top of the interview, she talks about how traumatic it is on the day that Peter is arrested, and how I can't really remember the different things that happened, and it was such a blur. But you were worried about getting arrested on the pro-Palestine march. And, how long were you on the phone to the solicitor for?
It's an hour, exactly.
Yeah. So,
going through the whole thing.
Nicola and Peter were very well represented. They knew that this investigation was happening for months and months and months. I think maybe, was it possibly even almost a year before there was the arrest. So this is a woman who is extremely well prepared. She would have had a plan, I have no doubt, and would have certainly had serious counselling from solicitors about how to go about it. I don't think she was a criminal solicitor herself, but obviously she was a lawyer. In fact, she was a criminal solicitor. She was involved in various domestic matters and family law matters. So she's not unused to these situations, and she would have certainly taken the same type of advice in the way that you did, and would have been mentally prepared for it. So I think some of this is performance more than sort of genuine response, and it reminds me particularly of the broom cupboard video, which is the point where
you need to explain that.
So this is the point where the gender self-ID, I think, should have been paused. Hamza Yousaf, as Justice Minister, had proposed amendments to the hate crime bill in regards to misogyny, which some trans rights activists within the SNP, some young members within the SNP, were very angry about and threatened to leave the party en masse over. And that prompted a very immediate and sort of seemingly emotional response from Nicola Sturgeon, where she records a video on her iPad castigating gender-critical feminists and sort of pleading with these young activists to remain within the party.
And the broom cupboard being?
Well, it was shot kind of looking down onto the iPad. It was in a sort of room somewhere in St Andrew's House, I think. But when I look at that from a technical perspective, I think that was very designed to be underdone. It was a bit like the Obama campaign, the first Obama campaign put out towards the end of the election, printed material that looked as if it had been poorly photocopied to give you the impression that this had been done just by local activists and that this was a really, really kind of grassroots thing. And we would come off the back of COVID at that point where everybody and their auntie had been schooled on, as you're always bashing people about, Leslie, not having your camera down so that we're seeing up your nose. And Nicola was the consummate COVID communicator. So I think it had actually been deconstructed so that the iPad was down and it looked really unscripted and personalized. And to my view, and this might just be my bias, but to me that looks as if it had been particularly designed to be underdone, to make it look more intimate and emotional and direct, and as a direct response rather than something that had been
and the thing is that
constructed.
Whatever, it had the effect. I do remember that vividly, of that sort of almost direct emotional appeal from a woman. And I think this relates to an awful lot of the stuff that's going on at the moment. I mean, Nicola had a total poker face, when it came to dealing with the public and everything else. She put a bit of humour in around the edges, but there was no getting to know. I mean, as we've just demonstrated, nobody knew Nicola, and she didn't talk emotionally or whatever. So that one video was completely astonishing because it was so departed from that. And the number of women who up till that point had been sort of willing to give the whole process the benefit of the doubt, the gender identity process, were so annoyed because by that point, whole loads of women had left the party for Alba. So that it was kind of like, which set of people leaving your party worry you most? And that, I think, was the tin lid for a lot of people. So, but I think this is the thing over the whole piece. It's the contrast between the poker face of the Nicola we knew and the kind of almost quite gushing woman that is now on display with Julie Etchingham et al. Is kind of quite hard to square. I would say there's also, though, a thing where people who who kept quiet at the time about being told to wheesht, essentially, and toe the line, it's sort of probably quite difficult for them now to also say, but at the time, actually, I tried to do this behind the scenes. I was told to shut up. I mean, I'm sure the public feel, well, if you sort of felt that strongly about it, why did you just sort of keep going? Why did you stay in the party? Why did you? Now, you'd have to say to everybody, when you've got in a job and a movement and a cause, how often with one thing do you walk away? And that's a kind of issue for everybody that gets raked back up again with all of this. It's all about, how do you believe? Who do you believe? And also, here we are talking, I've got to say again, I feel Pat sitting on my shoulder at this moment, because the both of us were so supremely not interested really in the ins and outs of leadership or leaders, except in as far as they create a sort of framework in which everyone else can operate. And that framework is still operating, as far as I can see, with John Swinney's government, in that it doesn't seem to be collegiate. The attempt to sort of reach out and do the thing about the convention with other parties has rapidly, seems to have hit the buffers. Kenny McCaskill's got a very interesting kind of article there saying it has to happen soon, fast, before the election. It looks like none of that's actually going to happen. And again, Robin is standing in for someone who's away. I'm going away next week. I'm not sure if he's going to get a fifth week at it, but anyway, his current one is just very interesting about strategy for independence, and really saying his view is there's really very few instances of a political party being the thing that gets you over the line, and lamenting that there's, at the moment, really, the civic movement. He's saying there's virtually no civic movement left. I'm sure yes groups would dispute that. I'm sure Believe in Scotland would dispute that. The problem still being Believe in Scotland is not the entire civic movement. But still, he's really saying we're depending on politicians who are the most unpopular set of people, for the public in terms of believability, to convert people to independence after someone gives us a referendum. So, that's an interesting kind of column there. about the consent building phase. I'm sure a lot of people think, yeah, just get on with it. And it's easier to build consent when you've got, a bit of a deadline. I mean, gosh, I'm going on holiday, and I'll tell you, this house will be squeaky clean because I'm doing a house change with somebody in Cornwall. I'm looking at it at the moment. I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but that deadline means it's going to happen, and I'm thinking about it constantly. So I still think there is some sort of journey needs deadlines, it needs summits, it needs things to aim at. And yet he's absolutely right that this constant reference back to, we need a leader, we need the politicians to get, to be leading us along. It is a kind of almost old-fashioned view of how democracy works.
It also chokes off a lot of the civic movement, and this happened when some of the other, Now Scotland and Voices for Scotland were sort of brought into being as a direct response to the frustration of the Sturgeon-Murrow years and the choking off of the grassroots movement. And Nicola, I think, saying very clearly at that point, I remember either in a speech or elsewhere, that she didn't think that there would be a successor to Yes Scotland, and it would really be taken forward by the SNP. So, there are lots, as you say, of Yes groups that are still going. They're not necessarily coordinated. They don't gather any information. They put information out, so they don't work in the way a political party would do or a political movement would do, more broadly, to identify people's views to independence, and they don't have the kind of money and infrastructure that you need to push forward. And John Swinney is continuing in that vein, saying that this has to be an SNP-led thing. Wouldn't even count on it's really other parties, although now, slightly softening or changing that stance in regards to the summit. But no real campaigning going on. I mean, the independence campaign started in 2012. Certainly by the end of that year, we were having washing machine-sized blocks of newspaper delivered to us on a monthly basis to get out. We were at an infrastructure for speaking to people and identifying whether they were going to vote yes or not, which should have prompted further activity to follow up with the ones that were persuadable. I don't think enough of that was done in terms of how they used the data that was being gathered. It didn't necessarily lead to a great deal. But there's still this, as they're choking off of the civic movement and not endorsing it, not making it feel that it's relevant and useful. You've spoken previously about the way that manifests itself in terms of, we don't do marching. That's for the hoi polloi. And poor John Swinney is still trying to prosecute his case for his campaign for independence, whilst Nicola's all over the papers with her book. And there was a big interview in the National yesterday.
Well, so let's move on then, because here we are sort of bemoaning, the amount of time. So hopefully we're not back here again with the next chapter. And I mean, so many people have asked me to read the book, review the book. I'm just sorry, folks, I'm just not interested. Really, life's too short. You do stuff, you move on. Because I've got to say, I'm a bit like that generally. Somebody had approached me from some library saying, we're very interested in having your archive. And I've got to say, I snorted with laughter. You mean all the backs of envelopes that I write the things on that were before we do the podcast, and the mounds of paper that don't make any sense, and I can't read them back, actually. Or the PhD that's scattered all over the place with bits kept here because I quite like that woman from Norway. And I mean, really? So it's sort of, I'm not knocking this because I did do a PhD. And if some people hadn't kept the things that looked unimportant back in 1920, there would be key bits of it that were missing for me. So I quite get that, that this need to sort of record where you've been, and absolutely agree that Robin's final thing is, because we didn't do an autopsy, as it were, on the 2014 defeat, we weren't able to learn anything. So that's perfectly true. But we've got to a stage where the avenues of what we'll learn are not sitting in the discourse that's happening at the moment, really, relating to Nicola Sturgeon. And it's obscuring all the patterns around us. I mean, like, for example, there's a lot of talk of, Nicola not being a feminist. You can look at it and remember back that she was the woman that put women on public boards, top of party lists. That caused some of its own problems, and was intent on improving childcare and did. But then, the piece that I wrote for the National last week was Kate Forbes. Actually, when we look back in time to the debates in Holyrood, had been trying to highlight the inadequacy of the creche in the Parliament for several years, actually. And you get to a stage, well, it's fine for this to be talked about, and yet the nuts and bolts of it are that about 5 or 6 prominent politicians from 3 political parties have stood down, and it might not have been the biggest thing in their lives, that the lack of a proper childcare in the Parliament. It's perfectly true that other people have odd work, well, not odd working hours. Nowadays, working hours are all over the place, and they too have nothing. But that's my point. If we're really talking about feminism, it's absolutely moving heaven and earth to get something that lets the bulk of women who are mothers, and it's usually the women, be able to keep participating in their working lives for as long as it's not harming their kids. And all the evidence is, just by the way, that the huge need for children is to have engaged play. And it's very hard if you've got one child, which is the average these days, to have one child sitting at home with you is very possibly not engaged enough. I'm not trying to get into massive arguments and dictating how people should run their lives, but just that the kids playing with one another from we're going to Finland, and I'm planning in that we're going to yet another kindergarten, because every time you try to talk about standards in education, people say it starts with a kindergarten, and that it's absolutely wall to wall. It's under £200 a month. It's full time. It's non-negotiable. It's excellent. It's well paid. That bit there. Everybody wants the Finnish revolution to be about something else. There's other things involved. That's a big bit. And we're not discussing this because we're talking about whether Nicola Sturgeon is believable when she's upset about an interview on television. Come on, everybody. We just need to fix this country and get beyond personalities.
Absolutely. And it's also, I think, the difficulty of switching off. Kate was at Herald Unspun in Summerhall last week, talking about some of the reasons for her standing down and her different views on various aspects of policy. And she said there was a situation before the summer recess where her daughter had fallen over, I think, and she had hurt herself really badly. So blood absolutely everywhere, totally floods of tears, and she's trying to comfort her, and she's got her on her lap, and somebody came over and said, I know you're really busy at the moment, I just have to say I really hate these wind farms, and tried to engage her in a conversation about wind farms when you could quite clearly see that she was dealing with this poor screaming 3-year-old covered in blood. So that always on aspect of it is very difficult as well. And as we've spoken about in the past, everybody wanting to do the job of the person below them, so MSPs jumping in and having to deal with council matters, and councillors, instead of looking at big structural things to do with their community, are now becoming a sort of call centre for the cleansing department, because people won't use an online form or won't phone the telephone number because of
but it's also because the hierarchical beliefs are so embedded in our heads. If you think you need to get something done in this country, you think you need to go higher up the food chain to someone you happen to know on top. And as we've just demonstrated in this discussion, some of the people that you think you're getting, the higher up folk, the MSPs, I mean, the bit that I find quite gobsmacking in something that Emma Roddick said was, she said to the audience of community councils who are on £400 a year, right, and have got no statutory input into anything, I understand that you feel powerless. I feel powerless. And you're kind of thinking, what? But the point is, an individual MSP is basically tilt. This is how it operates. So that in the end, everybody in a blooming system feels that they're powerless. And what's that supposed to do? This is meant to be a sassy Scottish government that's going to act on things to do with kind of land reform. It's pretty limp on trying to do the green transition and make sure that we get benefit and have control over where things go. That's not happening. It's kind of the lack of sassiness seems to arise from everyone thinking they haven't got the power to do anything. In which case, people will end up saying, well, why have we got you there? It can be so much better than this, but you have to start by acknowledging this top-down stuff isn't working.
Yeah, and you do have the power to do things, and the government can be governmental when it wants to be, and can jump in and do stuff, and it does often in ways that we kind of forget and ignore. But a kind of overly cautious approach, and in that interview yesterday with Swinney, they're still talking around a boycott of Israel or occupied territories when there's a clear route map for things that could be done. So if John Swinney wanted to make an announcement on these matters, he could do, rather than thinking about them and considering them and humming and hawing about them. Obviously, we want thought through policies, and we don't want government by speech. I mean, sometimes, I hate to go back to the Nicola thing, but there are occasionally, or quite often, policies announced that were simply applause points in SNP conference speeches that hadn't really been worked through at all. And similarly with Humza Yousaf and his most recent council tax freeze. So, the government does have strength. Now, on cheerier matters, you were at a cracking concert recently. Maybe we need cheered up a bit.
Yes. Well, when I was up, I was staying with my pals on the Black Isle, and they took me off to a Fesh Ross concert in Eden Court in Inverness a couple of nights ago. Now, the fashion movement, for people who don't know, I think it was set up by Arthur Cormack, actually, but I mean, a wee posse around him. And the idea was, it's maybe slightly mapped onto the Irish experience of teaching kids in Gaelic-speaking areas traditional music through the medium of Gaelic. I think I was actually maybe at the first Fesh, actually. It was 1989, I think, on Barra. And it meant all the kids came back for the summer and learnt everything, the burren, the box, the fiddle. They could basically become really excellent traditional musicians, but they were doing it all through the medium of Gaelic. So it was kind of like a double done of shoring up the local traditions. So anyway, that fairly spread, and actually it's gone right across. All the islands now have got Fesh, so the plural is Feshin, and across onto the mainland. So most of the Highlands have got them, and actually there's a Fesh in Edinburgh. There's it's spread across Scotland quietly. And this is another thing that does my head in, because these are tremendous achievements, actually, which, because they're not sort of like headline news, people are not probably aware of. Anyway, Fesh Ross was also one of the early ones, and that's the county of Ross that, of course, no longer exists because it's part of Highland. But anyway, Ross knows that it's Ross. So Fesh Ross, long-standing one of these. They've done this incredible thing where they've got a kind of trail of groups of young people who've been brought in, who gets sort of trained in every aspect of music making, actually. And this, to me, is the key point. It's not just turning up on stage and playing. It's how you present to the audience, how you do the cabling, how you do the get out, when you arrive beforehand, how you speak to one another, how you act as a team, even how you drive the transit if you're that age, how you get a license, how you do the whole 9 yards of it. So that was very impressive. And these guys have been going around doing tours around Scotland. They've gone to the big event in Brittany, whose name has just leapt out of my head, and have done incredibly well there with all the traditional musicians from the world, actually, but particularly Europe. But the really moving bit was there was sprinkled amongst each set of young folk that were coming on. There was a few people who had learning issues. There was a couple of people who looked like they had Down syndrome. And the really moving thing about it was you saw in different constellations some of these young folk playing away like Billy-O. I mean, obviously, many of the kind of reels and jigs and whatever that are part of Scottish tradition start off quite slowly and then fairly start to shift, because the object is very largely to get people dancing. And so they kept that down, because some of the people beside them were having difficulty just keeping the basic song going. And you could see them just judging their own pace, constantly looking over, reassuring the artist beside them, actually not introducing what the songs were when they could encourage the young chap with Down syndrome to do it, and he did do it. It was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary bit of just showing what belief and kind of taking everyone across the road at the same time. Not you nipping over because you're faster and you can see a gap. The game was to keep everybody together on that. And how moving it was that some of the melodies that anyone from the Highlands knows, and the audience was full. I mean, it's completely full. There's about 400 or 500 people in there and 2 seats vacant. You know, the whole audience know the Dark Island. And so no matter how, if there's a difficulties in some people's tuning and all the rest of it, it doesn't matter, because the culture is being reinforced by the wideness of who is able to play it to a group of people who are ready to receive anything that sounds vaguely like the Dark Island. So I've got to say, as you can hear now, I'm pretty close to it again, but I mean, boy, was that uplifting. And Fesh Ross are doing an amazing job on practically, as usual, no money. It's diddly squat they're getting essentially from Highland Council and a lot of the rest from Creative Scotland. But I mean, if people are making more impact on cultural tradition, on inclusion and everything else in the Highlands, I would be really astonished. So all part of your elbow, Fesh Ross.
Well, we'll put a link up to that as well. That sounds really very cool indeed. I think it was the Festival Interceltique de Lorient that you're...
That's it, Lorient, yes.
Which obviously just trips off the tongue, of course, when you've not Googled it. So yeah, that sounds really fantastic. Do we have any idea when the wind film will be out, or is that
honestly we're back with kind of loads of little bits of film, and I'm still trying to transfer the bits that were recorded on my phone, because we're all using iPhones to film now, astonishingly. I've got to say, the other thing that slightly occurred to me is, obviously I'm 65, the young couple, Katie and Chris, who were filming with me, are half my age. And there's definitely a thing of, I'm totally of the generation that you have everything taped, completely sorted, fallbacks, and everything's checked and double checked. And I realise it's because we started our working lives before mobile phones. So you couldn't, fix it as you go along. You had to have it all right, because if you got somewhere and, you hadn't checked everything, there was nowhere else to go with it. You couldn't think on your feet. And from contact with everybody this weekend, including some of the younger interviewees, I realise how much everybody under the age of 30 or maybe 35 is kind of just able to work on the hoof an awful lot more than us oldies that are all trying to get it all tacked down. So it's been quite an eye-opener about different ways of operating altogether.
Although I think that's the BBC apprenticeship, surely, that makes sure that you can't come away having spent a fortune with 6 trucks worth of stuff and nobody's actually remembered to press record.
Except we've all done it. Anyway.
My dad used to do the telecoms infrastructure for the mod, and I thought the BBC producers were fantastic, because they would never swear in case there was an open mic, although I think that's gone by the wayside nowadays. Camera number 12, you're a buffoon.
Totally the same.
You're an absolute imbecile. Camera number 12. There was all these kind of sort of dancing, really insulting camera instructions in the headset, but without actually swearing.
Yeah, no, I must say, I'm still very like that. I need to get right out of the room, the whole venue or anything like that. And I'm still slightly looking around me to kind of, but anyway, so but nonetheless, it was very good crack. Filming was great, and it just is a question. Coming back to the point, Katie and Chris have 3 children under the age of 9. So this is getting slotted in and around and about. And I am going on a week of actual holiday where I'm not doing anything else at all. So we're trying to cram this all into just getting the script ready and sending each other bits and bobs in 2 days flat before I disappear on Saturday, which is why next week
we actually will have the aforementioned extras, which will be the culture extra for everybody and the Nora conference for subscribers, and that'll go out on Tuesday the 26th.
So we'll see you sort of the week after that, feeling perky and
I've just
highly
done it myself.
refreshed.
That'll go out on the 19th, and we will see you on Tuesday the 26th. And on that completely garbled and totally mixed up note, we will see you the week after next, folks.